Welcome. You have made it to episode 1 of season 5 of Meet the Press Reports. Thanks for being here. Theocracy. It isn't a word you often hear in American politics these days, but given the religious rhetoric coming from some Republican candidates this year, it doesn't feel as far-fetched or hyperbolic as it would have been in the past. Frankly, it feels possible. There are candidates embracing the idea that whatever the First Amendment actually says about the free exercise or establishment of religion, that this wall between church and state should actually come down. And not only that, these folks argue the wall was actually never supposed to be there in the first place. In fact, here's Lauren Boebert. She's a freshman member of Congress from Colorado. She was speaking this summer to congregants. Here's what she said.
The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk.
She's not alone. The Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania, the nation's 5th most populous state, said this to his supporters.
So much for this myth of separation of church and state.
That's right. And that's the same position that Michael Peroutka, the Republican nominee for Maryland Attorney General, it's a position he's taken since at least 2014 when he called the separation of church and state, quote, the great lie. And he added, there can be no separation of God from government because he, capital H there, created it. That would have been news to the founders, especially Thomas Jefferson, who was the first of the founders to use the phrase, the wall of separation metaphor, to describe the First Amendment's religious freedom protections. Other Republicans, though, are openly embracing Christian nationalism.
We need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian, and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
Even the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade has religious overtones. It has been cheered on by conservatives on religious grounds. And in fact, it's actually led some liberals to look to the religious freedom restoration laws, many of them vigorously opposed over the last decade, to use these laws as an attempt to challenge these statewide abortion bans that are being passed around this country. So, as a country, we are entering unknown territory. What is next? Where is this movement heading? My colleague, NBC News correspondent Ann Thompson, traveled to Moscow, Idaho. It's a blue enclave, small blue enclave, in an otherwise ruby red state that has been grappling for years with questions about the role religion should play in the public square and everyday life.
In northern Idaho's dunes of grains and grass, a battle without bullets over the direction of a town.
I believe that what's happening in Moscow is a microcosm of what's happening all across the country that started here maybe 10 or 15 years earlier than what's happening across the country.
And that is?
Well, just the radical division. I don't think our nation has been this divided since 1859. It's divided and it's inflamed. And that whole process, I think, began to be visible here a decade or a decade and a half before it became radically visible in the nation as a whole.
Pastor Doug Wilson leads Christ Church in what he calls a Cold War civil war.
Our rights come to us from God and not from the government.
Fighting in, of all places, a college town. Moscow, home to University of Idaho and just 8 miles from Washington State University, exudes a live and let live vibe.
One of the interesting things about Moscow is how these two entities live side by side, and I mean literally. Right behind me, that's the offices of the Christ Church. And right next door is the headquarters for the local Democratic Party.
From this former art house movie theater, Wilson leads his campaign to make Moscow a Christian town.
Idaho is a very red state. Moscow was historically a very blue dot in this red state. And so consequently, the fact that we've done this has been disruptive in the minds of some, but the feasibility of evangelizing in Moscow had to do with the importance of the university and the size of the town.
So in your version of a Christian town, would there be a place for non-believers?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Would there be a place for same-sex couples?
What, you mean legally?
Yes.
You mean like marriage? No marriage. But there'd be same-sex couples.
No marriage, even though it's the law of the land in the United States?
Just like Roe used to be, right? In my belief system, in our doctrinal stand, and what we believe the Bible teaches, homosexuality is not only a choice, but a sinful one. Yes.
It is a muscular, masculine-led vision of Christianity.
Scripture tells the man to provide, protect, and love. Scripture tells the woman to honor, help, and submit.
Expounded on his show Man Rampant.
Men are going to be dominant no matter what you do.
And articulated in his blogs. This one saying marriage is a little kingdom and the husband is a little king.
A wife should be submissive to her husband, as Paul teaches in multiple places, yes. So a wife should be submissive to her husband. But in the blog post that you just cited, I made a special point of saying that the woman exercises authority over the selection of the one that she's going to submit to.
So when you say wives should be submissive to their husbands, does this mean, why shouldn't they be equal?
Well, because God created us a certain way. So we want to fit with the design.
Former Mayor Nancy Cheney says the community has endured decades of Wilson's often incendiary ideas.
When some kind of outrageous statements were made early on about Southern slavery as it was, as a mutually affectionate relationship between master and slave, or saying that members of our LGBTQ community, trans people, should be exiled or possibly stoned, that catches our attention.
Wilson says he was misunderstood, rebutting the many controversies on his website, writing he does not believe in the death penalty for homosexual acts or that slavery was a positive good. But the visible and invisible lines being drawn here and elsewhere across the country are setting off alarm bells for many faith leaders.
Do you consider Christ Church a church?
I don't.
Really?
I really don't.
What is it then?
I see it as a dominionist cult.
Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Stevens leads the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Palouse.
In the public square, I don't see them representing Christianity. I don't see them representing the values that I find in the Bible. I see them representing patriarchy. I see them fighting the culture war.
Stevens' position in that war is visible for all to see. A stained glass rainbow chalice. Wilson fights with the printed word. A prolific author, he's written dozens of books, all distributed by his own Canon Press. It publishes more than 1,000 different titles, half of which are books and materials serving hundreds of thousands of homeschool and Christian students nationwide. Wilson laughs off the cult accusation, but the former Navy man embraces culture warrior.
You can't have a naval warfare without ships, and you can't have tank warfare without tanks. And as I tell Christians all around the country, you can't have culture war unless you have a culture. Our tagline is all of Christ for all of life. So we want to be 7-day-a-week, 24-hour Christians in everything we do. And a distinctively Christian culture is forming here, and not reclusive and not cultic, but it's distinct.
Here in Moscow, Wilson and Christ Church have built a multi-million-dollar enterprise that includes a K-12 school, a publishing house, a college, and a streaming show. Pursuits that some worry will change the very character of this town.
What scares me is that he is making Moscow into a Wilson town.
Keely Emerine Mix is a former pastor.
What worries me is not that the stamp of Christ might be wrongly shoved down the throats of my neighbors here in Moscow, but that the stamp in the foot of Doug Wilson will be wrongly and is being wrongly crammed down their throats or standing on their neck. I think that his influence on this town has been despicable.
Aubrey and Wyatt Knickerbocker met 2 years after her family moved to Moscow, seeking a Christian town.
We found what at first we thought was a very welcoming community. There was something every day, something new, some sort of baby shower or something for the school. you get very swept up in all of it.
Until they heard this message from another pastor in the church.
Women should wear women's clothes. They shouldn't wear pants.
Shouldn't have short hair.
Shouldn't have short hair. Men shouldn't wear earrings. No one should have tattoos.
And then there was this, a psalm sing in the middle of the pandemic, protesting the local mask mandate, retweeted by then President Trump.
That was when I realized that these were not people trying to spread awareness or trying to spread the good news of Christ. It was people trying to say, look at us, we are so oppressed.
Did you feel betrayed when you realized that? How would you describe your feelings?
Yes, very betrayed, because I've grown up in the Christian church, and it never occurred to me that a church could be wrong and how wrong they could be.
They stopped attending Christ Church. Aubrey says she was attacked online. Now they actively avoid patronizing businesses run by church members.
If it was another church that owned it and they just happened to have some beliefs that I didn't agree with, that's fine. But when you're hurting people, that's when you have really crossed many lines.
Are you being judged on your faith rather than your product?
I believe 100% that that's true.
Josh Flickner says he came to Moscow seeking a Christian community and found it in Christ Church. But his business, Journey's End Cafe, is paying the price for where he worships.
I really wanted this place to be actually a bridge builder in the community. And so, yeah, it's really a bummer that that a lot of people in the community are just so full of bigotry that they do not want to even try to build those bridges.
He says his workers are threatened by crank calls and his future by a social media campaign calling out businesses run by church members.
Look at what people say about my business and then pretend like I was not a white heterosexual Christian male. That would be a hate crime. Anywhere else in the country, against any other type of person, that would be a hate crime.
3 weeks after this interview, Flickner announced he's closing the cafe.
So how close is Wilson to reaching his goal of turning Moscow into a Christian town? Well, no one is quite sure, but everyone has an opinion.
Honestly, it's almost laughable, only because you're talking about a minute percentage of the population.
George Scandalos and Brandy Sullivan own restaurants and businesses on Main Street.
As someone who was served on the city council, I haven't seen any traction gained in that area. The last two elections, there were some candidates who were members of Christ Church, and those elections were very uneven. And
I would call it a landslide.
There you go.
In defeat?
Yes.
You have 700 active households, about 2,000 church attendees. This is a city of 25,000 people. Is the way to reach your goal to bring in more people or to convert the hearts and minds of those who already live here?
It would be both. Yeah, we would want to persuade the people who are already here, and we want to welcome the people who arrive here.
Like many other churches, Wilson's deals with accusations of sex abuse, including a deacon this summer pleading guilty to a federal charge of child pornography, and Wilson marrying a released child molester to a church member.
The thing that upsets people is not the child molestation offense, because there are 20, 30 sex offenders in Moscow, and everybody knows the name of one of them because of where he goes to church. Right? The ones who don't go to church, they're all okay. They stay out of the newspapers. But the one who is repentant and wants to live right and is, straightened out, we're going to go after him because this is because the target is actually me.
Wilson, if anything, seems energized by the criticism and attention and undeterred from his goal.
Do you see expanding this microcosm from Moscow to the full United States?
It's hard to envision how that might happen. I think it would be wonderful if it did. So if there were a reformation and a revival, that's something we pray for regularly. And if what is happening here caught fire and spread elsewhere, I would be very, very grateful.
We're going to look at how these dynamics are playing out in our national politics and how the forces of Christian nationalism are likely to impact where we are headed with both political parties. Next. Welcome back. We've ingested a lot, so let's do some digestion. We brought together a panel of experts. NBC News correspondent Ann Thompson, who was just in Moscow, Idaho. Andrew Whitehead, he's a professor of sociology at IUPUI in Indianapolis, and he's the lead author of Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. Former Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo of Florida is also an NBC News political analyst. And Anthea Butler is chair of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania and author of White Evangelical Racism. Welcome to all of you. And let me start here, which is you went there, you did this piece. There's a lot of concern about what's happening. After doing this piece, are we making too much of what's happening with Christian nationalism, or is this the beginning of something?
No, I don't think we're making too much of it, Chuck. I asked Reverend Stevens, who's in the piece, who opposes what Pastor Wilson is doing. I asked her, I said, are you crazed that I only show up, people like me only show up to ask questions about Christ Church? And she said no, she feels that the country needs to know about this, that there are people out there who want to take the country back to a more Christian culture. And so I don't think we're making too much of it. It certainly is a strong movement. You see it in our politics today. Will it have legs? It seems to, at least in Moscow, have reached a certain, it's reached its limits, I think, and it will not grow any further unless they import people.
Andrew, do you think there are degrees of Christian nationalism?
Yeah, there really are. Okay. So when we survey the American public, we find that Christian nationalism is really a spectrum where you have Americans on the very upper end who strongly embrace these ideas that the U.S. is a Christian nation, that it plays a special role in God's work in the world globally, all of those things. And then you have Americans that think Christianity should play a role in American society, but wouldn't go so far as to say it should be privileged. And then we find that there are many Americans that resist and reject Christian nationalism as well. And so the important thing is that it's not a binary either or, but that it's a spectrum of belief and strength of embrace of these different ideologies and ideals.
Yeah, Anthea, where would you draw the line? Because there are many people on the left side of the political spectrum who say, yeah, you should incorporate more teachings of the Bible into your public policy. But what is that line where it becomes Christian nationalism?
I think the line becomes when people become so dogmatic that they want to step over into a violent space. And what I mean by that is the people who want to impose something on someone else. I think one of the great things about America is that it's a democracy, right? And that America got started by people who were escaping religious autonomy so they could have religious freedom. And so one of the things I think is really important here in the delineation between what is Christian nationalism and what is not Christian nationalism is what are people trying to impose? Are they trying to use their Christian nationalism to do a takeover? And then finally, who gets to be included as a Christian, in America? And I think that's a really important part.
Carlos, I want to put together two things. One is from a former colleague of yours, Adam Kinzinger. But before I get to his comments, I want to play a piece of sound from the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Al Mohler, who absolutely embraces this label. Take a listen.
We have the left routinely speaking of me and of others as Christian nationalists, as if we're supposed to be running from that. I'm not about to run from that.
And Adam Kinzinger tweeted when Marjorie Taylor Greene said something similar, we need to prove to people we are the party of Christian nationalism. He tweeted, he then quoted, he put in what he says is a quote from the Taliban that says, we are the party of Islamic nationalism. And then he writes, I oppose the American Taliban. And he then signals Kevin McCarthy and his. What is happening inside the GOP on this issue?
Well, what Kinzinger is pointing out is the hypocrisy in all of this. It has been Republicans and conservatives over the years who have criticized other countries, like Muslim countries, for imposing religious beliefs and practices, and also for attacking communist countries for imposing atheism and banning people from practicing their religion. So what's happened here? That this has become a part of the culture wars. And this is the bunker mentality that Donald Trump and other conservatives have pushed a lot of the population into thinking that they're under assault. And I think, look, we have to be sensitive. The pace of cultural change in our country has been pretty rapid in recent decades. I think
depends
social
who you
media.
are.
Yeah.
Okay. Like it's rapid for some, it's really slow for others. I mean,
but we have to understand that some people increasingly feel excluded, left behind, and obviously that generates a lot of anxiety, and that's why people act out in these ways. But when it comes to our leaders, I think Kinzinger is right. I mean, we have to be consistent, and we can't be hypocritical in saying, these countries shouldn't do this and that, but it's okay for us to do it here because it's the religion that we prefer.
Andrew, what do you make of this active debate inside the GOP?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because really when we look at it, Christian nationalism, and Anthea brought this up earlier, is about power. And when we think of that in terms of a democracy and a functioning democracy, it's about sharing power and playing by the same rules. And so with Christian nationalism, we find over and over that if it comes down to democracy or power, they're going to choose power every time. And so this idea of a country for the people, by the people, it's really a country for a particular people, by a particular people. And so for those in the GOP, trying to figure out, are we really about democracy where we're going to play by the same rules or not? And that's the big question, I think, at stake.
And one of the things that I think some of us have struggled to sort of get our arms around is how are Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene, two female Republicans, such big advocates of Christian nationalism, and you had this gentleman on who is made it clear every marriage is a kingdom and the man is the king.
Right.
I mean, it is sort of like this is one of those where it's hard to wrap my arms around that.
It absolutely is. And I asked him, I mean, like I said, why can't you be equal in a marriage? And he's like, well, we weren't made that way to be equal. And I thought, this is not about biology. It's about intelligence. It's about dignity. It's about who you are. But that's not how he looks at it. He takes a very literal reading of the Bible. And I can't understand why a woman would submit to this.
Let's pivot. How much to the campaign trail? I think a lot of these self-described Christian nationalists, statewide level, Carlos, are going to lose. It's probably, I think Doug Mastriano is more likely to lose than win. He's running an odd campaign. But just being the nominee, haven't the seeds been planted for more of these candidates to run?
Well, it depends, Chuck. I mean, this could be part of the trap that Republicans have set up for themselves where they elect the most, quote unquote, conservative candidate out of primaries, and then these people just can't win. So eventually this movement will likely just be extinguished because people get tired of losing. That's one theory. But certainly, I mean, it shows that at least there is a critical mass of support that can get these people past primaries. And by the way, going back to Christianity, and Ann, maybe you could shed some light on this, but Christianity, I mean, Jesus Christ invited people to follow. It was never an imposition, right? Because
let's put it like that. He did not twist their arm. You could come or not. You want to follow this guy, you don't. That's all it is.
Anthea, you're concerned that this spreads, that even these losing Christian nationalist candidates, by losing, they've been mainstreamed. I mean, we're going to get criticized doing this program because, hey, you're going to bring more attention, and that attention inevitably is going to lead to people, oh, it's more mainstream than I thought.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things to remember is that if we don't pay attention to this right now, we may be on the losing end later. I think, to tie off of this comment about the GOP has had slogans like this a long time. It's been, whether it's been Make America Great Again or American exceptionalism, all these kinds of things, right? What is more interesting right now is that the religious and the political are being put together. And that makes for a very powerful mix. And I think whether or not people win in November, we still have to contend with this in 2024.
And there's something else, though, going on here, which is sort of the country's growing more secular, which almost at the exact same time, those that are religious are almost becoming more fundamentalist.
Right. But
almost out of fear of this growing secularization.
And that's what I think it gets to, is that there is a great deal of fear. And if you look at the issues that they grab onto, the issue of abortion, the issue of same-sex marriage, opposing same-sex marriage, the issue of gender identity, all of those are driven by fear. And I asked Pastor Wilson that. I said, America is becoming less Christian. Fewer Americans want to be part of organized religion. And he just sees that as a further challenge. He believes he can change minds.
And Andrew, is it almost a feature that Moscow is the place trying to do this because they almost want to be reactionary to the majority of the population? It's easier to find fundamentalists in a place that that maybe you feel like you're the outsider?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the insights of sociology is it's easiest to define who we are when we know who we're not. And so when you can define yourself against who you're not, that's really powerful. It creates very powerful in-group bonds. We're going to pull together. We're going to face the outside threat, the things that we're afraid of, and it becomes a really central part of your identity. And that's what's so powerful about Christian nationalism.
All right, the separation of church and state. How strong is this still in our country, Anthea?
I think the idea of it is very strong. The reality of it is not. And, if we think back to Christian Coalition and all these other groups that were passing out voter guides in the churches in the 1990s, if we think about the ways in which, Trump voters invoked all of this and Trump himself invoked this, we think about the ways in which candidates now really play to all of this. I would say that the separation of church and state is very thin, if not non-existent.
Very quickly, Carlos, if you tried to run a campaign that said, I'm going to be so strict about separating church and state, I'm not even going to try to campaign at churches, could you win?
I think so. It depends where in the country, but in more suburban districts, I think you still could.
You're more optimistic about
in
it
rural
than I
areas,
thought.
much harder.
All right. What a terrific conversation. Thank you all. Thank you all for being with us on this first episode of our 5th season here at Meet the Press Reports. The next episode, get ready to meet the American oligarchs. Are we just auctioning off American political power to the highest bidding billionaire? We're going to pull back the curtain on some of the recent big money players and booms in this year's politics. I'll see you next time on Meet the Press Reports and this Sunday on Meet the Press.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.